بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. ونتضرع لله ونقول: اللهم اصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، واصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، واصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، واجعل الحياة خيرا لنا، واجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير، واجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر. وصل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آل بيته الميامين، وعلى أصحابه الطيبين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Every week, I ask people to send me articles and writings with a view towards what would be appropriate to talk about at Jummah. And the articles that I end up reading in preparation for the khutbah are somewhat like getting a pulse on the ummah as it exists in our day and age. And getting that pulse is often, if not always these days, a traumatizing endeavor. And the temptation, when you feel that sense of trauma, that you're reminded of how much the ummah collectively, if we imagine Muslims as a single unit, as part of a single body, reacting to each other's pains and agonies, like a human being confronted with overwhelming pain. The nervous system of such a human being is overcome. And when the nervous system is overcome, if they're lucky, they pass out because the brain cannot process this amount of pain. They enter into a physiological slumber, disconnected from reality, a state of unconsciousness. Of course, the unconsciousness is a brief respite, because once they come back to consciousness, the likelihood is that the same things that have caused the pain in the first place are still there. So either the response is to disconnect from reality, and if the brain consistently becomes overwhelmed, the risk is for that brain to become delusional. In fact, losing touch with the very reality that induced the trauma in the first place. The Muslim ummah is confronted all the time since the age of colonialism with an overwhelming amount of trauma. And like a human body, the temptation for so many in this Muslim ummah is to disconnect from reality, or to misperceive reality as the collective intellect enters into a realm of fantasy, a realm which they hear and see, perceive, think in terms disconnected from the reality that induced the trauma. I suspect that this is part, or a great part, of why so many khutbahs every week is disjointed and disconnected from reality. I suspect that in Muslim spaces, there is so much discourse that can only be described as delusional, disjointed from any pragmatic engagement with the reality of the ummah. It's quite simply the trauma is too much to process. But of course, here's the thing, is that it is impossible, if you cannot trust your doctors, because as an ummah, those who often pose as our doctors are the same figures that colonized the ummah in the first place. In other words, the holders of medical science in this allegory, the holders of the paradigm of progress and rationality and reason, those that are supposed to aid the ill and the inflicted and the suffering, the doctors, are indeed the same individuals who authored and were responsible for a great deal of the trauma in the first place. Because those doctors, wearing another hat, acted as the colonizers. The patient cannot turn to the doctors, who can only provide sedatives, but are conceptually blocked, conceptually unable to get themselves to truly heal the patient. Those doctors, the only thing that they can get themselves to do is to provide sedatives. But otherwise, the patient, the ummah, is on its own. Does this patient, if this patient wants to escape the cycle of painkillers and sedatives and hallucinogens that simply give the patient a brief respite and a brief break from the pain but treat nothing, if the patient wants to emerge out of this predicament, is it at all possible without the patient confronting the pain, carefully analyzing the sources and the reasons for the pain, before beginning a possible journey to healing? Just this week, you get plenty of examples of this same phenomena that we are talking about. CARE came out with a report titled Islamophobia in the Mainstream. The report is quite good. But it is not enough that we say it's quite good and move on. Because what it says between the lines, not explicitly, but between the lines, is far more alarming than what it says explicitly. So, according to this report, carefully documented, from 2017 to 2019, from 2017 to 2019, as a representative sample, so I get the number right, as much as 35 charitable institutions funneled 35 charitable institutions funneled over $105 million into 26 Islamophobic network groups. Over $100 million by 35 charitable institutions funneled to 26 Islamophobic networks. So, Christian advocates serving evangelism, that's the name of one of the charitable institutions. Christian advocates serving evangelism. Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, the Schwab Charitable Fund, the Marcus Foundation, the Adelson Family Foundation, the Jewish Communal Fund. These 6 were the top funders from the 35 to a host of Islamophobic networks. Mind you, this is just from 2017 to 2019. The recipient institutions, when you analyze the recipient institutions, they break down into 2 main groups. Christian evangelical groups interested in converting Muslims to Christianity, and Jewish politically active groups interested in serving Israel in the loosest terms. But these organizations, recipients of these millions of dollars, employ an entire infrastructure of individuals whose full-time job is to attack and malign and distort the image of Islam and Muslims. The impact of this network that is capable of spending over $100 million just from 2017 to 2019, the impact is felt by every Muslim on the face of this earth. The impact is felt by our children in their schools, by their parents in their workplaces. The impact is felt internationally by what non-Muslims say and feel about Muslims around the world. The impact is felt in China, in India, in Burma, but the impact is even felt by Muslims within Muslim countries themselves. The impact is felt as Muslim intellectuals, whether consciously or subconsciously, learn to be alienated and embarrassed and threatened by anything within Islamic culture and Islamic history, and to constantly feel on the defensive. You pause for a second and reflect on simply the facts that this report flags. When before have we ever had in history not just governmental policies commanding great armies with huge budgets, but when before in history have so many people donated so much to simply malign and slander a faith, a religion, and its followers? So many people were willing to give up millions of dollars that could have been spent on luxury items, on material objects, on egoistic indulgences. But millions of dollars were sacrificed. These people decided that instead of treating their own egos to material objects, they would rather give that money to malign and demonize Islam and Muslims around the world. Either because they believe they love Christ more than anything, and they want Christ to trump and defeat Islam, or because they believe they love the Zionist idea and the state of Israel more than anything, and they want the Zionist ideal to always be dominant and supreme over Islam and Muslims. When you look at this amount of spending, does it remind you of a historical fact? And the obvious answer is yes. This spending is undertaken by private individuals, represented by private organizations, to literally raise an army. Raise an army that maligns, attacks, and assaults a religion and its followers. The obvious parallel is something deeply embedded in the mind and conscience of the West. And that is the Crusades. The difference is the Crusades were declared military campaigns by governments in the West against Islam in the East. But here, coupled with military policies that targets Muslims at will are these huge so-called charitable institutions that dedicate an enormous amount of sources. Now you pause and think about that. We often accuse non-Muslims of materialism. But it is not Muslims who give the most to serve an idea, a cause, a principle. It is the crusading non-Muslims who do so. We often say that politics in the non-Muslim world is marked with realism and pragmatism. But it is not the Muslim world that engages in ideological politics. Indeed, it is the non-Muslim world. Indeed, it is quite often non-Muslims who do not simply satisfy with themselves with pragmatic politics, with real politics, but that put an ideology, an idea, a principle ahead of pragmatism. The doctor and the patient. So the patient, being Muslim, looks at the doctor, represented by the advanced, technologically, scientifically advanced West. But the doctor consistently lies to the patient. You look at the doctor and you think that the doctor is driven by an unprincipled sense of consumption and self-promotion. And it turns out that the doctor is driven by an agenda, by a set of principles. You look at the doctor and you think that the doctor lives egotistically and hedonistically. And it turns out that this doctor is actually very much ideological. And the ideology of the doctor, whether consciously or subconsciously held, is to always dominate, and subjugate the patient. This patient believes. The patient deludes himself or herself into thinking and believing, I care about my religion more than anything in the world. Really? A huge part of your agony and trauma is indeed because you don't care about your religion. Why is it that from 2017 to 2019, there are Christians and Jews willing to dedicate over $100 million to doing nothing but funding, subjugating you, controlling your intellect, controlling your conscience. The effect of this money is felt by our children in their schools, by their parents in their workplaces. For every Muslim family that has a child that converted to Christianity, the culprit is this money. For every Muslim family that has had a Muslim child that became a drug addict, there is a very high possibility that the culprit, or at least a portion of responsibility, is this Islamophobic money that made a Muslim identity so traumatizing and so challenging. For every Muslim family that has had children that grow up disillusioned and alienated from who they are as human beings, the impact of this money is enormous. The trauma is undeniable. Over $100 million from 2017 to 2019 spent by a people committed to the idea of alienating you from your faith. Of course, because there is so much money, it influences politics. And so you have, as the CARE report documents, all types of politicians groveling to get part of this money and in return target and malign and attack Muslims and Islam. What do you do with a patient who will not just refuse to spend money to free himself or herself from this abusive doctor, not only refuse to spend money on finding an alternative means of treatment and health, but a patient who has often fallen into a relationship with their abuser where they've become addicted to the abuse itself. So not only do Muslims don't even come close to matching the amount of spending against their religion, not only do they not spend, but we witness an amazing phenomenon where Muslims, in this case the United Arab Emirates and Saudi, in fact contribute money to Islamophobic organizations. And doing so doesn't at all act as a disqualifier among their fellow Muslims. They can do so, and they can find plenty of Muslims in the world that still speak about Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and countries like Egypt in neutral, if not positive terms. What do you do when, in fact, as the report documents, the Trump administration appointed and hired and empowered more Islamophobes, more racists, more Islam haters than any administration in the world. And yet you have plenty of Muslims that either like Trump, defend Trump, apologize for Trump, say things like, well, he's not really an Islamophobe. He's just a pragmatic politician. He's just playing politics. The Muslim patient is not just ill-informed. The Muslim patient has become completely disconnected from reality. The Muslim patient is experiencing constant hallucinations and delusions. How do we liberate the Muslim patient from the clutches of this abusive doctor? What do you do when in the same week that this report comes out, confronting you with the painful fact that as you go around as a Muslim scholar, as a committed Muslim, scrounging and begging for a donation of $100 here and $100 there, at the same time, those who absolutely hate you and hate your religion can count on millions of dollars being donated to serve their cause. What do you do when, as a committed Muslim, you have an extremely hard time finding fellow Muslims who are willing to put aside their egos and their self-interests and their aspirations and their professional goals in order to serve Islam as a cause? At the same time that you have such a hard time finding human beings who are Muslims, who are committed to a self-sacrificial extent, there are so many non-Muslims who are willing to give up their entire lives to do nothing but attack and malign your faith. But at that same time, how many of us remembered that we just went by or just experienced the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo? That 20 years later, after the opening of Guantanamo or the imprisoning of Muslims in Guantanamo, many Muslims remained there. That the entire enterprise of Guantanamo, detaining high value assets, in the war against terrorism turned out to be a sham. That the intelligence actually gathered from Guantanamo detainees turned out to be largely useless in the fight against terrorism. That for 20 years, Guantanamo has destroyed the lives of thousands of Muslims and continues to do so, and the Muslim patient is oblivious. I just read an interview with Amy Goodman of the first Muslim chaplain James Yee, who objected to the fact that Muslims were being tortured and mistreated, and that Guantanamo detained people who were clearly underage and people who were clearly innocent. And for his troubles, that Muslim chaplain was in turn arrested and imprisoned in Guantanamo. And I read an interview with Amy Goodman. And among Muslims, how many people have read the book that James Yee wrote? How many people have even bothered to listen to his interview? How many people even consider Guantanamo a personal issue? Because it creates an exception to the entire edifice of human rights and humanitarian law, and that exception is a big Muslim exception. The entire logic of a place like Guantanamo is that Muslims are an exception. We care about human rights, we care about humanitarian values, but not when it comes to Muslims. The Muslim patient is very ill. How many people know that Guantanamo, for reasons no one can explain till today, imprisoned numerous Uyghur Muslims and Chechnyan Muslims who were not even accused of plotting against the United States or Europe, who were not even accused of being part of terrorist organizations. How many people know how many lives of Chinese Muslims were thoroughly destroyed because of Guantanamo? And Chechnyan Muslims were thoroughly destroyed because of Guantanamo. I read an article about a Uyghur Muslim in China, a woman sentenced to 14 years in a concentration camp because she was accused of teaching the Quran, and she was arrested with copies of the Quran. And the plight of Uyghur Muslims in China, with the plight of Uyghur Muslims in Guantanamo, with the plight of Uyghur Muslims in Saudi, with the plight of Uyghur Muslims in Egypt, with the plight of Uyghur Muslims in the Emirat, the Muslim patient is very ill. Because all of this are illnesses, failures, diseases. And the Muslim patient continues to be oblivious. And the Muslim patient continues to hold on to the myth that the world progresses basing itself solely on rational, objective principles of progress. The Muslim patient is oblivious to how much of the world is in fact ideologically driven. Not by pragmatism, not by materialism, but by the ideology of power and dominance and control. And that within that ideological paradigm, the Muslim and Islam only belong in the lower tiers, in the subservient tiers. Exactly like the Crusades. Exactly like colonialism. The terms of expression and manifestation are different. But the reality is very much the same. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم واسأل الله يستجيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. A good friend, I don't know if they were thinking of the khutbah or not, but anyway, they sent me a copy of a document that has just become public. This document was a 1964 contract signed by the Saudi government with the British government. And according to this contract, the British government agreed to supply the Saudi government with a military unit called BMM-SANG, where the British government agreed to provide a military unit of an indefinite duration. The military unit would exist and serve as long as the Saudis wanted it to serve, in return for a substantial amount of money and other remunerations. The British military unit had one purpose and one purpose only: to keep the Saudi family and the Saudi government in power. In 1964, at the heart of the time when Saudi Arabia was exporting Wahhabi Islam, at the very thicket of the time when the Islam that you and I were raised with preached to us about how it's haram to celebrate the Prophet's birthday, how it's haram to greet fellow Christians, greet Christians or Jews, how Muslim women should be veiled and secluded, etc., etc., etc. The champions of this Islam were paying their former colonial masters in an official agreement so that they can be kept in power whether their people want them or not. You see, do you think a British government that signs an agreement with the so-called servant of the two holy sites, guardians and servants of the two holy sites, the agreement is to keep them in power, whether their people want them or not? The purpose of that military unit is to make sure no one can remove this family from power. Do you think that this government has any incentive to promote an idea of Islam that is consistent with democracy or human rights? Do you think that the way the structures of power work, that there is any reason that this government, like so many other Western governments, is in any mood to talk about an Islam that teaches its adherents dignity, freedom, liberty? Who are the people, do you think, that this government is willing to fund when it comes to Islam? Who are the people that do you think this government is willing to hire? Isn't this just an indication of the same world we exist in today, the world of smokes and mirrors, where colonialism is very much a reality? Crusading is very much a reality, but is now has all become camouflaged and just more nuanced and sophisticated. Mind you, look, it all has to do with the consciousness and the willpower of the patient. When is this patient going to tell the doctor, go away, I don't want to listen to you anymore, I'm going to look within so I can start healing, I'm going to confront my demons, I'm going to confront reality? Because look, the United Arab Emirates was just elected to another term as a Muslim representative on the Human Rights Council, an international body that champions the cause of human rights. And there were Muslims, all on the payroll of the United Arab Emirates, in the United States and outside the United States, who cheered as the United Arab Emirates continued to play a role in the Human Rights Council in the United Nations. Sisi of Egypt just had a conference on human rights. One of the worst fascist abusers of human rights on the face of the earth today just had a conference in Egypt about human rights. But as the United Arab Emirates takes its seat on the Human Rights Council and is praised by the Muslims it bought for its tolerance, its humanitarian values, a woman called Huda Sarari. Huda Sarari exposed the unbelievable, as a journalist, she exposed the unbelievable human rights abuses committed by Emirati forces in Yemen. Thanks to Huda Sarari, we learned about the secret detention centers and prisons run by the Emiratis in Yemen. We learned about the people burned, cooked alive in these detention centers. We learned about the mass, pervasive scale of sexual assaults committed by Emirati soldiers in these Yemeni detention centers. And Huda Sarari is targeted by the Emirat, as detailed in an article called "She Helped Expose Secret UAE-Run Prisons in Yemen and Paid a Steep Price." Huda Sarari's life has been destroyed, and her family have been destroyed. This is going on at the same time that the Emirat, through the power of its money, takes a seat in the international body of the Human Rights Council. At the same time that we have the story of Huda Sarari, I was yet reminded again of the human rights activist Ahmad Mansour, an Emirati citizen who, because he objected to the human rights practices and violations by the Emirati government against its citizens, continued to be disappeared. The last time he was seen, he was held in solitary confinement, tortured to a point that he became unrecognizable to his family. But you see, the world has learned, in the same way that Guantanamo, that there is an exception to human rights, an exception to humanitarian values, and that is the Muslim. The world has learned there is an exception to genocide and the prohibition against genocide, and that is the Muslim. The world has learned that there is an exception to the prohibition of colonizing people's homes and expelling them from their land, and that's the Muslim exception. They talk about Muslim exceptionalism. Muslim exceptionalism is not about maintaining the integrity of Islam. Muslim exceptionalism means that Muslims are an exception to the conscience and consciousness of the world. In the same way, the world has also learned that there is an exception to integrity and truth and authenticity in speech. That when it comes to Muslims, take their money because their values don't matter. Muslims themselves are very good at lying to themselves. They can talk about being the guardians of the two holy sites and about Salafi Islam and Tawheedi Islam and al-Wala' wal-Bara'. They can talk about all types of things, but they can, when it comes to behind the scenes, rely on a foreign occupying force to stay forcibly in power. They can talk about how Islam is against democracy because Muslims want to continue justifying the rule of a corrupt family like Al Saud. They can talk about tolerance of the Emiratis, but have their prisons full and torture a consistent practice. They can love dictators like the Sisi. They can respect religious figures who are hypocritical and liars and ignorant. The world has learned not just to fear Muslims, not just to hate Muslims, but not take Muslims too seriously. Because Muslims don't take themselves seriously. It's like that patient. Oh, this patient is hallucinating all the time. This patient says all types of things, but this is a sick person. Who listens to the hallucinations of a sick person? That's precisely how the world deals with us. We are the hallucinating patient. But here's the thing. I have a surprise for you. This patient is actually not sick at all. You see, this patient doesn't have a virus, doesn't have a bacteria, doesn't even have a fever. This patient is actually completely and fully healthy. The problem is that this patient has been listening to their abusive doctor for years. And the abusive doctor has convinced this patient that he, in fact, is ill. And so the patient, in fact, feels ill. But in reality, God has given this patient a health that is superior to the health of his doctor. How do we liberate the patient? Well, you're not going to liberate the patient by continuing to lie to the patient and continuing to affirm the patient's delusions and continuing to validate the patient's psychoses. The only path to liberating the patient is to break in, confront the patient, and scream in his face, "You're not ill. You are fully healthy. Get up, get dressed, divorce this doctor, and walk out. Learn to think for yourself, feel for yourself, act for yourself, represent yourself, and promise yourself to always be truthful and honest with yourself. Because what landed you in your hospital at the mercy of this doctor is the fact that you learn to lie and deceive yourself. That's it. That is really it. اللهم اعف عنا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا يا علي يا عظيم واهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا Allah. Allah, forgive our sins, guide us to the straight path, help us to be better Muslims, better human beings, to serve you and represent you on this earth, Ya Allah, in a way that befits you, Ya Ali, Ya Azim. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وأقم الصلاة.